Welcome. Thank you for joining us for the Opportunities in Life Science Entrepreneurship Roundtable, hosted in partnership with Fauna Bio. I'm Jen Blinkel, Director of New Product Development at APS, and I'm happy to be with you today to help facilitate this conversation. Now it is my pleasure to bring in the panelists. Today we will hear from Ashley Zehnder, CEO and co-founder of Fauna Bio, and her colleague Katie Grabek, Chief Science Officer and co-founder of Fauna Bio. They are joined by Tony Kulesa, a principal at Pillar VC. The three will participate in a conversation today to really help kind of guide through what are some of the things you need to think about, what's to be aware, and how do you start this idea of looking into entrepreneurial activities. My first question today, I'm going to toss this out to you first, Ashley, and that is, what inspired you to seek an entrepreneurial career opportunity or to start Fauna Bio?
Yeah, thanks, Jen. And I just want to say thanks to Jacob and Jennifer for putting this panel together. I think it's really exciting to get to talk to academics who are maybe thinking about kind of what to do with their academic degrees. I know we were all kind of in that same position not at all long ago. So I think that's really exciting. I would say, from my perspective, it's interesting because I never saw myself as starting a company. My husband likes to remind me that when we first met, I was a veterinary intern, and really what I wanted to be was a specialist in veterinary practice. And I was pretty adamant that I never wanted to own my own practice or be my own boss. I just wanted to do what I wanted to do, which was take care of animals at the time. But it was one of these situations where even when I was growing up, my parents had always pushed me to, kind of go as far as you can, right? When I was really little, actually, the age that my kids are now, my kids are 7 and 10. I had told my mom that I really wanted to run a pet shop, was my career aspiration at the time. And my mom kind of looked at me and was like, well, maybe you should aim a little bit higher. So I'm like, okay, veterinarian. But then the idea was take that as far as you can go. And so they were always pushing me to say kind of what's next, and what can you do that maybe has a higher impact. So I think a lot of how we started Fauna came out of the work that, Katie has done, which she'll talk about, and my co-founder, Linda, and myself. But it was really this idea of looking for opportunities, where is work not being done? Where are the big questions? And trying to pull together a bunch of maybe diverse experiences. And then you sort of look at a career that maybe spans a lot of different avenues. I've worked in zoo medicine and diagnostics and basic research and clinical research, exotic animal practice. And sometimes when you take those kind of career paths, it can feel maybe a little bit meandering. And then you realize that actually all those aspects of the career that you've built can sometimes make you the perfect fit for something like this, which really takes into account a lot of the work that I did that was more clinical or translational during my veterinary career in exotic animal practice, but then my basic research during my cancer biology PhD and trying to understand shared molecular pathways across species. All of that really feeds into a lot of the work that we do now at Fauna. And so now in hindsight, that career trajectory makes sense, but it doesn't always seem like a straight line when you're in it. So I think a lot of it is just being open to new opportunities and trying things, and sort of not being afraid to try things that maybe you feel like you don't have experience doing. So I think, you don't always have to think that, all I'm going to do, what I want to do is start a company to end up starting a company. You just have to be open to opportunities and figure out what's the best way to achieve the goals that I want to achieve, which is really making a difference by working with these species that not many people have experience with.
Thank you, Ashley. Katie, how about you? What led you to co-create Fauna Bio with Ashley?
So I'll follow on. I don't think I had intended to start a company, long ago when I was in my early 20s. I liked the idea of inventing and creating things and solving problems, and I would daydream ideas of like, someday maybe I'll start a company about this, or maybe I'll invent this, but it was always just a daydream. And, when I was on a road trip in a car, that was about it. And then I thought, really to start a company, I probably would have to win the lottery to even have enough money to start my own business. I didn't know anybody who had started businesses, and just seemed like a long shot. And I went into science, so it wasn't really in my head that was what I was going to do. But fast forward, I got my PhD and then was doing my postdoc, and I really knew I loved the research I was doing. I just was fascinated with hibernation. I didn't want to leave. but I also wasn't sure that I wanted to be a professor. And so I was kind of caught in the middle, like, well, I love my research, I love what I'm doing, but is the academic path really for me? And towards the end of my postdoc, I had started applying for academic positions, and I almost had somewhat of a mental breakdown where I just thought, wait, this is kind of like what's expected. This is the next logical step. You do a postdoc, then you become a professor. And I thought, what have I really stopped to ask, is this what I want out of my career? And so there was just this big moment of like, I don't know what I'm doing with my life. And no, never mind how competitive it is just to become a professor. I wasn't really in love with the whole, writing grants and publishing papers. It just didn't, like for me, publishing papers kind of anticlimactic. And, quite honestly, if I was honest with myself, I was kind of just burned out by the whole process. And so when Ashley and Linda, my co-founders, asked me to consider starting a company with them, I thought it was a long shot. I thought it was kind of crazy. Like, I can't even get a grant. How are we going to do this? But I thought, why not? Why not, brought up that peak interest to invent and create things. And we started spending our lunch hours just discussing business ideas. And I thought, maybe we could do something with this. And I think even just the environment, we were at Stanford and as postdocs, and there are a lot of people who are spinning out companies out of Stanford. And so after a while, you get a little envious. You're like, well, where's my startup? So-and-so started a company. Well, where's mine? And so it just kept my mind a little bit more open to starting a company. So.
Thank you, Katie. And we definitely hear that sentiment around, academic life is not always for me, but what else can I do? Tony, what brought you to your career?
Well, I think I had a lot of similar experiences to Ashley and Katie. When I was doing my PhD, I also kind of started off thinking I really wanted to build spend my whole life in academia. I love basic science, and I still love basic science. In fact, like I've been building a lab in my basement. I can't stop myself from doing these things, but all the other things that came along with doing basic science, I wasn't a fan of. I worked in technology development. I'm an engineer by training. And the thing I thought should be the metric that I should care about is users, right? Like how many people are using the technologies that we build and for what purposes, and how disappointed would they be if they lost access to it. And I felt like that was completely disconnected from citations, which I think is more the currency of academia. And so my advisor even had to like twist my arm to go beyond just putting up a preprint. Because I'm like, once I put up a preprint, then it just starts this game of talking to reviewers. And same thing with grants. I just feel like there's kind of this one place you can raise money from, or like two places you can raise money from in academia. Whereas in private sector, you can raise money from all kinds of different people with all kinds of different objectives and ways of working with people. And so I just felt it to be very freeing to like focus more directly on how do we get impact, and how do we find the right people and partners and funding to put that all together, than the kind of more monolithic approach within academia. But that kind of set me on an entrepreneurial path, and I was thinking about starting a company based on my own PhD work, much like Ashley and Katie. But I think I realized that, and actually I did try, and actually it was in antibiotics discovery. And if you want to hear why that's hard, I'm happy to elaborate on that. We were not able to raise money for it. But in that process, I realized that I learned a lot about kind of biotech. And I realized that despite the feeling like we're just on this incredible path, like it just feels like this is a special moment of history in the life sciences, the rate of company creation has been flat, and it's actually been flat for about a decade. And so I started to think a lot just at the meta level of like, how do we increase the rate of company creation? Like maybe that's the problem to focus on. And I can elaborate on this, but my thesis is that it's mostly cultural. It's about access to the networks and kind of knowledge of how to do it, which is why I'm so glad to be here today to maybe share some of that. But I realized that the business model, if you want to focus on ecosystem building and cultural change, and like the business model for that is investing, because then you focus a lot on ecosystem building, helping people start companies, giving them resources. And if you're lucky enough to invest in a few of them, then you can recycle the winnings from that back into continuing to grow the ecosystem. So I realized kind of my natural place was in investing, and that's how I kind of ended up in venture capital. And I still love the kind of really, really early stage, like ideation, and that's why I like doing I like to be the first investor in companies, and often before they form. So that's how I got to what I'm doing.
That's very cool. And I love the way your stories come together, Tony. I think your piece around how do we create access to these networks and how do we help build out these companies and this platform opportunity is a great connection between you all. You all three mentioned this idea of impact. How do you create impact? How do you generate the kind of impact that you're interested in? I guess my question for you would be, what skills, experience, attitude do you think helps either make you successful to help create that impact, or help scientists or people be successful in your companies to create that impact? Anybody want to jump in?
I could jump in. I think one thing I didn't realize was that all the soft transferable skills that you obtain in your PhD really actually poise you to be successful in entrepreneurship. We're used to failing and learning and recalibrating and trying again, which happens so often in startups. And then you have to be very open to receiving criticism and feedback and taking that and learning from it. And then we wear many hats, so you have to obtain very deep knowledge very quickly, and then you have to find the correct strategy and apply it rapidly. And that's something that you learn to do in your PhD and postdoc. And then, also working independently, there for a long time, there were just 5 of us at the company. And so we'd say, well, here's a bare bones project or idea, please development. We gave our senior scientist, Ray, empty benches and said, please develop our wet lab, and poised him with, ordering everything. So that's something, you learn when you're becoming an independent researcher. And then just being able to be outside of your comfort zone and just being comfortable that you're always going to be outside of your comfort zone and pushing yourself. And then I think one thing I never realized too, is funny, is like how much playing youth soccer has helped me with the company, because it's really less about you and your ego. And, we have no names on our doors. There's no like Grabek lab, right? It's all about the team. We're like this team of great researchers, and we're all working towards the same goal, and we have to work together and hand off complex tasks. So just being able to work in a team also helps you.
Yeah, I think one thing that we hear from employees that we've hired, particularly our first couple of employees, so I was sort of curious, like I understand why we founded a company, and the 3 of us are all in and we're starting this company from scratch and it's kind of our baby, but then to come in as like employee 1 or 2, like that to me almost seems harder, right? To sort of trust those founders with that vision. So just talking with those employees, and talking with early employees of our kind of colleague startup companies, it does come down to impact, right? It's frustration. People are frustrated in academia, feeling like their major output is papers and grants that maybe don't get funded, and then wondering how that work is going to get out in the world and actually make a difference, as opposed to working with a small group of people who are all aligned toward making that transition happen. And it doesn't matter whose name is first, third author on a paper, no one cares. It's just that the work gets done and that it gets done correctly. And I think one thing that people worry about transitioning from academics into industry, that they feel like their academic or scientific rigor will suffer. I think it actually is a lot of times the opposite, right? I think obviously there's issues with reproducibility in academic work, and that can ripple across all kinds of industries. But I think for our purposes, right, we have to make sure that it works, right? Because we're building a company around results that have to be true, right? It doesn't help anybody if the graph is pretty, if the data isn't right. So for us to build a therapeutic set of programs, the data has to be good and done to a very high state of scientific rigor and reproducible and reproduced by multiple independent hands. So I think people are kind of oftentimes pleased and surprised by the level of science that they get to do in high-tech startups, where the goal is to really do high value science in a rigorous way. And I'll second Katie's thoughts here about just being humble and open to what you don't know. I think that's the fun thing about doing a startup, is that you do get to challenge yourself constantly, and the job kind of matures and changes. Every couple months, being a CEO of a startup is actually a different job. As the team grows and as programs progress, and you start hiring people to work under you that maybe have decades of experience in industry, and all of a sudden you're sort of like you're their boss and you have to figure out what that looks like. but you just come into that with humility, and say, you're bringing experience that I don't have. I want to learn from you everything that I can. And taking that as a challenge, I think, and being willing to be open about the challenges. It makes it very good for people who get bored easily, because you're never bored.
Tony, is there anything you would add to that list?
Yeah, I would say one of the things that really surprised me was how important communication skills are, and like I'm not even sure how to define what communication skills even are, but I feel like in my academic training there was kind of a culture of like, just let the data speak for itself, like just show people the data, and everyone, if people are specialists in your field or something, they can just like read it and understand, and they'll make their own inferences. But then I find like in where I am now, you can't just show someone some piece of data, and like you have to kind of motivate it first, and then explain like, they'll have to care about it before they are going to spend the time trying to understand what the data says or something. And so now I find like interacting with a lot of scientists and trying to coach them on like, how do you get people excited about your work and how do you communicate it, and the data is like the thing that comes last, not to still to the point that Ashley said. I think everything has to be held to extremely high standard of rigor, because things ultimately have to work, but people also have to care about them first. And so making people care about something is actually quite challenging if they're not
People are
already
inspired by bar
self-selecting.
graphs, as it turns out.
Yeah, we're inspired by bar graphs. And then the second thing I would say is, one of the things that I found really surprising is just like how much wider of a diversity of personality types there are outside of like academic. I used to think like, wow, there's a lot of different kinds of people in academia. But when I left, I was like, I don't know, actually, all those people are kind of similar in a lot of respects. And then you start meeting people, and not everyone is going to have roles in their company or whatever, an industry, that are going to be outward facing. But if you do have an outward facing role, I mean, or at least for me as an investor now, I interact with other investors all the way from wealthy individuals up to bankers and professional portfolio managers, and those are completely different sets of personalities and different incentives. And then founders, and some founders are they have all kinds of different motivations, and then early employees that we're trying to recruit to our companies, other VCs, all kinds of there's just such a wide diversity, and learning to interact with people and understand how they think has actually been really stimulating, really interesting to me.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think the team, the communication, the how do you work with people, and the data, that a bar graph, that's my new favorite quote, a bar graph's not a motivating, exciting piece of information. So you kind of told us like what helps people work. What do you think the biggest misconception that people have coming into or even considering startup world is? Tony, would you like to start that one?
Sure. Well, actually, I think that's one to start with, what Ashley brought up. I think a lot of people, like I was just watching the Theranos documentary or TV show, I forget what it's called, The Dropout, which is fantastic, by the way. It's a fantastic story and really well done TV show. And I think it's definitely worth watching. But I think a lot of people get stories like Theranos in their head, and then they think, oh, startups are all about telling a story and blah, blah. But I actually think that the quality of data has to be extremely high. And often you'll look at startups, and they might be doing things that academia was doing 10 years ago or something. And it's because, now you have to do it such it'll really work in a human, and not just one human, but humans of all different backgrounds and genetics, and have other kind of diseases, and are treated differently, and like kind of less like they might take their medicines at different times of the day, or like, and so there's actually a really high standard for what it takes to make a drug. So I think that is definitely one misconception. I don't know, Ashley and Katie, I'm curious to hear what you have to say. I can think of more, but I'll stop talking.
I'll just say one briefly that I get all the time when they find out that the three of us all have children, 2 children, in fact, is like, is that possible? It's like, yeah, it turns out it is. I do see my kids frequently. I take them to school at least a couple days a week and pick them up from school. Zoom has helped. So COVID sort of helped with that a little bit when everybody got chased home. Kid Zoom bombing became okay. In professional settings, it's not like a stigma anymore to have your kids Zoom bomb you anymore. So I think it is possible to balance family life and startups. I think you have to be good at fencing those things off. Katie does a much better job of it than I do, I will say, much better at partitioning those things than I am. So I'm trying to learn from Katie, but I think it is possible to live a life and run a startup, and you have to figure out how to balance those, because you can't do it as a sprint for the multiple years that it takes to build a high quality startup. So yeah, I don't know, Katie, if you want to add to that or have a different misconception, but I think you do it well. Then.
I try to do it well, but it's always a struggle, but yeah, it's possible. And I think I think in many ways you can have a better work-life balance starting a company than in academia, just because we work as a team and there's a lot more support. I think another misconception I had from what I saw in academia was that I thought to start a company, you first had to become a professor and then really spend years of work doing research. And someday, if your research was amenable to it, you could spin out a company from your discoveries. That's what I thought how it worked. But it turns out you really don't need to wait to start a company. And in many ways, becoming a professor and being in academia, the longer you are there, the harder it is, I think, to transition out. You just have to shed so many different habits. And then you also have a lab, your mindset's just different. So I think it's more about having this idea that you're really passionate about and you believe in, and you can build a business model around, and hopefully you have find some good co-founders that are going to work with you. But really just a willingness to give everything you have into making it work. To me, like starting a company really does feel like having a baby. So I call Fauna my middle child because I have 2 kids and we started Fauna in between the 2. And it's like, there's never going to be a perfect time to start a company. You'll never be 100% ready. And once you start, you just have to be prepared to do whatever it takes to keep your company alive. Like when we started, it was just like, just don't let that baby die, do what it takes. So.
Yeah, it did feel a lot like having a newborn, actually. Yeah.
If I could add one more misconception that I was thinking about, it would be that I think a lot of times people think the hardest, or what we tend to get the most questions about, and like what people are most interested in, is how to fundraise for startups. I think actually fundraising is one of the easier parts of it. I think recruiting is actually the hardest part of growing a startup. I don't know, Ashley and Katie, if you guys have felt that, but yeah, I think
time and stage.
that at least to me has been the most surprising thing, like how hard that is. And you think like, oh wow, I'm just going to recruit my friends, but it turns out your friends have their own ambitions or have other job offers, or like, and it becomes hard once it becomes real, to get people to join you. So I would say that I don't know, that was, I think, something that surprised me.
I think we've been, and I know there's a question in chat actually about fundraising, which we will get to in just a moment. I think we've been extraordinarily fortunate growing Fauna, that the people who have come to us through our various roles are kind of uniquely inspired by what we do. There are not a lot of companies that do what we do, which is really mining all of this extreme animal physiology with an eye toward human health. And there are people who are like, oh my God, I've wanted to do this my whole life and I didn't know you existed. And they come to us saying like, what do you need, right? So I think if you're really differentiated in a certain way that inspires people, I think it helps because you really sort of find your tribe, or they find you rather quickly. So I think we've had a couple of bouts of hiring and been able to find people that are a good fit. But yeah, if you're like the 50th CAR T company, it might be a little hard. Not to diss on CAR T, but like, it helps if you've got like a very differentiated story that people are like, oh my God, I wanted to do this my whole life and now you exist. It's like, yes. So that helped. We have that in our favor. Yeah.
Also being mindful of company culture. I used to just, I thought, well, what is this? Like this fluffy term, but actually it's very important. Your culture when you're building a company is very important. And that helps with recruiting. You want to have an environment that people want to come to work in and be excited about what they're doing and can do their best work. So.
Yeah, you've really been the guidance of like we need to intentionally build a company culture. You've been like all over that, which has been awesome. I will quickly just try to address the fundraising question because I know we're getting close to time. I think we environment matters, right? We were in an environment at Stanford where we had the fortunate opportunity to run into Laura Deming, who was one of the VCs that first started funding aging research, started Longevity Fund, and was coming to Stanford to talk to folks in their bioinformatics program about the work that she did with Longevity Fund. That was the first VC I ever interacted with. And I was really inspired to hear a venture capitalist talk about science as a motivation for why they wanted to start the work that they did and really wanting to support cutting edge science and research. I had never thought about it that way. And so we reached out to her about some of the early ideas we had. This is when we were still even thinking about starting a company. And it turns out she was starting an accelerator for people building companies in the aging space. A lot of the diseases we work on and the models we work with are used for aging research. So we had an invite to join the Age One Accelerator, which really did its job, accelerated us quite nicely. But it was interesting, the three of us starting Fauna, it was very much a Three Musketeers thing. We were all in the same postdoc. We all had very unique skill sets to bring to this particular company. It was an all in, all out situation. And we sort of decided, we had like 2 days to decide if we were all going to leave our postdocs and start a company in 3 weeks. It was a very short timeline. And we just sort of figured we would never forgive ourselves if we didn't try. It was like, well, we have to try this. And, it turned out that then, of course, you start to build a network of people and start to learn how to network. And I know, Jen, that was one of the things we talked about in the run up to this webinar, is how do people build networks? I think just getting to know people, going to webinars, meeting people in different situations, and building those networks then allows you to get to know other venture capitalists who want to fund different stages of development in the company. And learn kind of, Tony, like what you mentioned, how to tell your story in a way that is compelling. I think that is what Laura tried to beat out of us rapidly, which is still a process, is like the academic side of you and wanting to just, if I just drown them in data, it'll be okay. And it's not. You have to get out of that mindset, but it almost takes a retraining to do that. So, we've since raised 2 rounds of venture capital from different institutional investors. The first one was very tech focused, very much on the platform and the data and what we were going to do with it. The second fund toward the end of last year was more about that transition from data, but then into life science building. So it's a fund that really is right at the intersection of comp bio and really wants to and supports therapeutics development, but also kind of healthcare or software startups. So it's a really good fit for what we do. And a lot of it is finding a fund and investors, be they angels or whoever, who understand what you're building in that vision, because you don't want to take money from the wrong people. And so that actually finding that fit is really important. I don't know if that helps answer the question, but.
Yeah, thank you, Ashley. That was, I think, a
And
very
I'm always
well.
happy to connect with people on LinkedIn if you want more details.
There you
Get
go.
on LinkedIn.
And we will share your contact info in just a sec. Now we are running out of time, so I want to ask you all one last question. If you could offer people advice who are considering going into the startup world, what would it be?
I've been talking too much, Tony, Katie.
I mean, I think the biggest difference for us was, having great co-founders. I really enjoy working with Ashley and Linda, and we all grow and help each other. So I know you can do on your own. I think it's a little bit harder, and maybe if you're a second-time founder, it's probably easier. But I'd say having great co-founders, and then really just networking, talking to other founders, learning from them, and learning how to build your network and speak to investors, and just being more confident. I would have told my earlier self, be more confident. It's going to work. Don't worry so much. So.
I would say that the world is super flat, and it's probably surprising how flat it is. Like, it is actually not that hard to reach out to the CEOs of public companies, for instance, and they often will take the call, especially if you're emailing from an EDU email address, and especially if you're a student, because everyone has a soft spot in their heart to help students and does not see them as a potential competitor or something. So, they're usually willing to talk. And I also think academia is kind of like the clergy. No one's worried about competition, so they're happy to talk to academics. It's definitely a privileged position in society. So I would abuse the EDU email address and just reach out to people. And it might be awkward at first, but you'll quickly get comfortable with it. If you're just just looking for information and building your network. And so when I was in grad school, I did lots of kind of student organizations and things to connect with people in the industry, but I also just spent probably 2 hours a week, probably 4 meetings, 4 half-hour meetings, having coffee with people who had in all kinds of different industry roles, right? Not just founders and investors, but people that had all kinds of roles. And that just helped me build a bigger picture of what is it that's out there, because there's this kind of monolithic idea that people have of oh, there's academia and then there's industry, but it's not really like that. It's more like there's academia and then there's the rest of the world. So you kind of have to find your place in it and what's best suited to your interests and personality type and so on. And then you need the network to help you get there. So I would just spend a lot of time talking to people.
Being open and asking questions. You may go into a meeting expecting to get information on one thing, and you may end up getting some other information like, oh my God, that was really useful, but I had no idea that that's what was going to come out of that meeting. So yeah, don't be afraid to reach out to people. I agree with Tony, the world is surprisingly flat. And I've been really pleasantly surprised how many people I've kind of cold inbounded on LinkedIn that have gotten back to me, that are just have had other people do it for them in their career and are kind of feeding it forward. There's a lot of that, actually.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Katie, for sharing your perspectives, for sharing your insights, for sharing your hard-earned experiences. You know, what I found really interesting is that you all really kind of honed in on the great thing about coming into this startup space is you can create an impact on something you really believe in. It's possible to have a life, and that the skills you gained in your PhD program really are transferable.